Hello and welcome to Monster of the Week, the show where we take old creatures from previous editions of D&D as well as other tabletop games such as Pathfinder and convert them into 5th edition monsters so you can run them in your current D&D 5e campaigns. My name is Josiah, also known as Dungeon Dad, and today we are talking about one of the most iconic monsters from classic horror. The Dullahan, more commonly known as the Headless Horseman, has roots in Irish mythology that stretch back hundreds of years. Of course, it is most famous for its appearance in the tales of Sleepy Hollow. This creature has since ascended to become a staple of the current cultural zeitgeist of modern horror. So today, as always, we're going to talk about just exactly what a Dullahan is. We're going to go over what it can do in combat and why, as well as how you would actually run combat with this monster. Then we're going to talk about some ways to change up combat and make it a little bit more interesting. And of course, we're going to go over some plot hooks, adventure ideas, and really dig into the lore of what makes this monster so awesome. This creature has been on my list of to cover monsters for a really long time, and I knew that when I did eventually cover it, it was gonna have to be during Spooky Month. The imagery of a headless rider atop a dark steed traversing through the woodlands at night is an image that is so ingrained in popular culture that even if you're not familiar with this monster in terms of its origins, you've definitely heard tales of the Headless Horseman, or at the very least seen something like it before. The specific stat block I'm basing today's conversion off of is the Pathfinder Dullahan, which I've changed up a little bit. In the original Pathfinder stat block, the Dullahan is presented as an undead creature. Keeping more in line with both my own obsession with fey monsters as well as the original Irish folklore, I've changed it to make it an evil fey from the unseelie court. But that said, you could easily keep it as an undead creature if that's more fitting for what you want to do with it. But whatever you end up deciding to do there, this monster has a lot to offer both in combat as well as from a roleplay and narrative perspective, and I'm super excited to get into it. But in order to understand how we want to use this monster from a narrative perspective, we need to be able to understand what its abilities are. So first things first, let's take a look at some. If you do like the idea of using a Dullahan in your game, definitely check out the description below where you'll find a link to a Google document that has my 5th edition conversion of this monster with all the stats and everything you'll need to run it there. Feel free to follow along as I go over this or set it aside for use later on. But when you do eventually check it out, one of the first things you're going to notice is that this creature has a lot of actions. When it comes to actually dealing damage, it's got two bread and butter attacks that are pretty simple. First and foremost, it has a long sword, which is going to hit for long sword damage as well as some extra cold damage. Nothing too crazy there, however, it does also have a spine whip. This, of course, is a 15-foot long whip made from human spines, which reaches out for a bit of slashing as well as a bit of cold damage, but most importantly, if it hits someone with this whip, the target is grappled. If it uses this attack to target someone who's already been grappled by the whip, the target is also pulled 10 feet closer towards the Dullahan. As a creature that's typically mounted, you can probably already start to imagine some situations in which you don't want to be grappled by this thing. And speaking of its mount, that also brings us to the other action you'll see here called Summon Nightmare. This ability, believe it or not, allows the Dullahan to summon a nightmare. For those of you who may not be familiar with what a nightmare is, it is a creature you can find on page 235 of the original 5th edition monster manual. They are dark, fiery horses that breathe brimstone and allow their rider to be resistant to fire while they're riding them, and they can do all kinds of other nasty stuff, least of which is fly. When it uses this action to summon a nightmare, the Dullahan can also mount it as part of the same action if it doesn't already have one summoned. But most of the time when your party encounters a Dullahan, it's probably already going to be mounted on top of its nightmare steed. However, if the party manages to kill that nightmare in combat, or for whatever reason it is without its mount, the Dullahan can simply use an action to manifest that mount beneath it. In terms of how this is going to work in combat, the nightmare will allow the Dullahan to basically control its actions, and it goes immediately after the Dullahan in the initiative order. Nightmares aren't extremely dangerous on their own, but when they confer the ability to fly as well as fire resistance to their rider, that's when they become pretty problematic. Anyone who's ever played Curse of Strahd knows exactly why. The other fun ability the Dullahan has access to is called Frightful Presence. If you've ever run combat with a dragon before, you know exactly how this works. Basically, as the Dullahan comes into the sight lines of creatures around it, it can use an action to force those creatures to make a wisdom save, and if they fail that save, they're scared of the headless guy on the burning horse with the giant sword and spine whip. Makes sense. I would be scared of that too. Being frightened in 5th edition isn't as debilitating as it has been in previous versions of the game, but it's going to come with many debuffs. Most importantly, you can't move closer to the source of your fear, at least not willingly. Being dragged closer by a spine whip, that's a different situation. So all of these abilities individually are pretty cool, but you start to get a really good picture of how this monster is going to fight when you look over everything it can do. The Dullahan is typically going to be riding atop a nightmare, so it's going to be able to fly around at 90 feet per turn, and while it does so, it's going to be lashing out with this spine whip, trying to grab people and drag them along for some extra damage. And if it's forced off its mount, either because the nightmare is slain or it just is forced onto the ground by some other means, it can always pull out that long sword and do a dual wield long sword whip situation. Which of course is not to mention anything about its frightful presence, which is going to be causing terror in its wake. It does also have multi-attack, meaning it gets to make 2 attacks per turn. That makes sense for a monster of CR 7. And the final ability that I want to talk about is called Death's Calling. This is a once per day ability, and it's kind of bizarre, and I'm going to explain why this ability is on the sheet in the first place. Essentially what this does is it allows the Dullahan to call on an individual mortal's soul to try to pull it out of its body. Effectively, this makes them more likely to die, brings them closer to the threshold between life and death. However you want to explain this, word it, and flavor it, it's essentially a curse. It gets to point towards a creature, and that creature has to make a charisma save. And if they fail that charisma save, they gain 2 levels of exhaustion, which sucks. Also, any successful attacks against that creature are critical hits, which also sucks. This effect lasts for 24 hours, or until the Dullahan has been slain. One other little bit of text you'll note here is that if the Dullahan speaks the target's true name when it uses this action, the DC is increased to 20 and the target has disadvantage on the roll. Still not impossible to make, but very, very unlikely. This ability in its entirety is a reference to the original folklore of the Dullahan. It was said that Dullahans were constantly riding throughout the mortal world, and if ever they were forced to stop, they would say someone's name, and that person would die. So this whole ability is just kind of like a D&D-ified reference to that part of the original folktale. It's a pretty powerful ability, but I can only use it once per day. It's also terrifying, both mechanically, but also from a flavor perspective. Imagine being that one PC in the party, and this headless, fey, monstrous creature gets off a horse and just says, "Jeffrey!" And you're like, what the hell, man? I don't know what's up. What? Hello? Why do I feel like dying all of a sudden? I feel less alive than I did a minute ago, you know? If nothing else, this should just really, really, really invigorate in players who encounter a Dullahan that you never give a fey creature your name. Because oftentimes, if it asks your name and you say it, that name is not yours anymore. It has a lot of the same sort of resistances and traits that you'd expect from most fey creatures. Of course, it has blind sight because, you know, it doesn't have a head, which means it doesn't have eyes. I feel like that goes without saying, but you're always going to have that one player. You know who you are. So now that we understand the true terror that the Dullahan is capable of unleashing, we're going to move along now and talk about some... The Dullahan is a classic Halloween monster, and there's a lot of different ways that you can use it. As I mentioned earlier, my imagining of this creature has transformed it into a fey monster. So if you happen to be running, I don't know, a new adventure from Wizards of the Coast that has a lot of fey in it, including a Dullahan could be really interesting. When encountered in the fey wild, I imagine that a Dullahan is almost like a knight, kind of the Unseelie court. Definitely evil and definitely nefarious in its ends, but I imagine them having that kind of knightly air about them and doing the bidding of some powerful archfey that sits atop some unknown throne. To this end, I would consider what type of things a knight would do in real life, and you can apply that to the Dullahan. Perhaps they've been sent with a message for the party, arranging some type of meeting between them and a much more powerful and mysterious entity. Even if the party doesn't end up fighting the Dullahan, just having the messenger be this bizarre headless creature atop a nightmare would be a very cool encounter and would definitely leave an impression, I think. Or perhaps someone has sent the Dullahan after the party to kill them. Once again, who knows why or where this creature came from, but it'll leave an impression. If you wanted to use this monster as a kind of monster of the week sort of encounter, a Dullahan is a great candidate for a creature that's wreaking havoc on a small hamlet somewhere. You know, you have villagers sitting around the hearth at the local tavern talking about a mysterious dark rider that's been spotted on the trails. People showing up dead, their bodies completely drained as their souls have been pulled away. No one knows why or how this is happening or who this mysterious rider is, and it falls on the party to investigate. That's the great thing about Fey creatures, is they're super weird, so the justifications and the motives of this creature, while it should have motive for doing these things, can be something nigh incomprehensible to most mortal creatures. Perhaps it's collecting souls for its master. Perhaps it has some sort of vendetta against the mayor of the town, and this is its way of slowly working its way towards its revenge. And just given the way Fae are, it might not even be the mayor themselves. They could have a curse laid upon them that stretches back like 50 generations, and now the Headless Horseman has come to collect. If you wanted to go the more sleepy, hollow, undead creature route, this could very well be a cursed individual. Someone who died in some type of unjust or unfair war or conflict, or maybe was even murdered and lost their head in the process. They might just be wreaking havoc because they're wreaking havoc on mortals in general. Anyone who crosses its path is just an outlet for this creature's anger. And then it falls on the party to either put that creature down or figure out what happened to them so that their soul can rest peacefully. I'm imagining an encounter on some sort of forested back road where the party is on some type of carriage and they hear the beating of hooves off in the distance and they know this kind of legend about the Dullahan that's known to stalk this area. And finally it appears in fire and brimstone and tries to pull one of the party members off the back of the carriage with its spine whip. If you rolled with the undead route as well, these guys could make great substitutions for the Death Knight. The Death Knight is like CR 17 or something, and a Dullahan at CR 7 makes a great replacement for that creature while being at a much lower level for a more mid to low tier party. If you treat it as an undead creature, you get a lot of the same flavor without all of the crazy, ridiculous power. In any case, that's all I've got for the Dullahan this week. I hope you found this video inspiring. I hope you have come up with some plot hooks of your own and thought of some fun ways to use this creature. Please be sure to leave a comment, like, subscribe, all that good stuff. It helps me grow the channel immensely and helps me keep on making these videos. If you're running a Halloween one-shot, or maybe you're running Beyond the Witchlight, or you just have a cool idea for how you would like to use this monster, definitely let us know about it in the comments below. Also, if you have any monster recommendations from previous versions of D&D that you'd like to see me cover and convert into 5th edition, please leave a comment, get at me on Discord, get at me on Twitter, any of the places where you can find me. I will add it to the list and you might see it show up on the channel. I also want to give a huge shout out to all the lovely patrons out there. Thank you so much for supporting what I do. If you are one of my fantastic patrons, you of course already knew this monster was coming because you get early access to the stat blocks and whatnot, and you also get the fancy 5th edition stat block with some extra lore tidbits and the cool artwork and the splash stat blocks and all that cool stuff. And most importantly, it also helps keep the lights turned on. If that sounds cool to you and you're not already a patron and you want to offer that extra level of support, you can find a link to the Patreon page in the description below there as well. But all in all, thank you guys so much for watching. I really do appreciate it. I'm really looking forward to covering some more scary monsters this month, and I will catch y'all in the next one. Until then.